Welcome to our webcast today. I'm Misha from IDERA. I'm joined here today with Matt Gordon and Ray Rios. Ray Rios is my IDERA colleague, which will be doing a presentation at the end and a demo of SQL Diagnostic Manager. But first up, we have Matt Gordon presenting the Setting the Right Foundation for Your Cloud Migration. So with that, I will hand it over to Matt.
All right, we'll do all the usual stuff, make sure the slide share shows up and behaves, and of course, not quite. All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen.
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay, we will get right into it because yeah, this will be a fast-paced hour. So this is what we're going to talk about. It's a heavy topic. It's a lot to get through in 45 minutes. I'm going to cover absolutely just as much as I can. But these projects are way more complicated than they often seem up front. I've been a part of some that were really sharp and some that did not go well at all. And so I want to try to pass as many of those lessons on as I can and kind of give some tips and tricks as well. These are all the different ways to find me online. I wrote a couple of books, including one that I co-authored on this very thing. So not only am I kind of borrowing on my own experience here, but some of the things I learned putting the book together with my co-authors as well. I'm SQL at Speed everywhere online, which is a good way to find me, and I encourage you to do that and reach out with questions, feedback, whatever. And also a reminder that I get to play with race cars once in a while. So if you're not too into the data thing, or if you are, but you are into the racing thing, I will talk your ear off about that. So a little bit more about me. I just want to draw your attention to that bottom bullet there. I know this is not strictly a community session, but do want to remind you that our data community does exist. So if you're a part of one of those groups, thank you. If you're not, definitely search out your local one. There's the Azure data community, there are AWS resources as well, Power BI user groups, all those sorts of things. So even though some of the groups may not all be back in person, there's tons of good resources out there. All right, so let's talk about why, and this says, why are we migrating databases? But I want to encourage you, even though we're data folks, and we're going to talk about data tools at the end of this, these projects are always bigger than us. They always outgrow us, even though we're often chosen to lead them. So let's talk about why we're migrating these things. And you may sit here and say, well, why are we talking about the why? The why doesn't matter. The why matters a lot because a lot of the technical, in fact, arguably all the technical decisions that we're going to make will build off of what the motivation is. So we need to understand why we're doing this before we get into the tech and talk about how we want to monitor and govern and all those sorts of things. So these are basically examples of ones that I've heard. I've been a consultant, now for 7+ years, and so I've come in on, like I said, projects like these that were very small, more of a POC type size, to very, very large ones that cost a lot of money and happen all over the world and all those sorts of things. So this comes from all of that work. So the first one, and honestly the most common one, especially with clients of a certain size, is they've come to the cloud because they want to save money, or they want to get to the cloud because they've heard it's a great way to save money. Certainly if you've read any newsletter, marketing speak, seen an ad, whatever, from any major cloud vendor, they always have, really great spins on, well, if you come to our database platform of choice, Azure SQL, AWS RDS, whatever, you do this certain thing with it, it's an X percentage savings over how you're running on-prem or over our competitive vendor or something like that. If the motivation is saving money, the one kind of overarching tip I'll say, and of course, there's an exception that proves every rule, right? But the one kind of overarching tip is think long and hard about platform as a service. So basically what that is like managed database services. And we'll talk later kind of more in depth about what that actually means for us. IaaS, or infrastructure as a service, basically means we're going to spin up VMs in the cloud like we're probably running on-prem. Not a lot of us are running on bare metal these days, though it's certainly still out there. But IaaS in the cloud is just, we have spun up VMs, but it's a data center we don't own or we don't rent. It's Microsoft, it's Amazon, it's Google, whatever. Those tend to cost at least as much as they do to run on-prem, sometimes more, depending on what your performance needs are and those sorts of things. Platform as a service can be a way to consolidate a bunch of stuff and cut back on the expense of running it. Not always, but often. So that's something to think about. If your boss comes and says, hey, I want your team to lead our move to the cloud, salesperson said we're going to save 40% off what we're running, definitely dig into those numbers, understand what that scenario was. And if that's your aim, you may not end up making the best technical decisions because you want to get to the goal that's been put in front of you. And it may not be do the coolest and best technical thing. It may be, listen, we really need to shave costs here. So that's something to think about there, and something if you've been a part of one of these projects, you've probably heard. Another one, which forces us to make some different calls, is data centers are closing. We're consolidating them. We have 10, we need 5. Or we have 5, we need none. Or we have 5, we only need 1. And our HA and DR and everything else is going to be in the cloud. That often comes with a deadline, because usually this is tied to some sort of a real estate transaction. It's, hey, our lease runs out in 6 months. We got to have all of our stuff out. Or our contract ends in 9, and we got to have all of our stuff out of 5 of the 10. That would force some different technical decisions, because you're trying to get out of there by a fixed time. There's generally not flexibility in those without spending a whole bunch more money. So you may do some things, in deference to the speed at which you need to work, rather than maybe, again, the perfect technical decision, like, well, this is the best thing I think I could build. It may take too long to build that thing. A third one, which is a legitimate one, and I've heard this, is just my boss told me I had to do it. Often these are strategic initiatives and things like that, where maybe you roll up to a vice president of data or vice president of IT, and the CTO or CEO has said, this is the year of the cloud for us, and you've got to do it. And all the teams that work under you are going to be working on this project. It's priority number 1. Off you go. That is, like I said, very legitimate, but worth asking these other questions as well. Why are we doing it? Are we trying to save money? Are we trying to close some of the data centers we own? Are we moving to a different platform even? All those sorts of things. My boss told me I had to do it is where the conversation starts, not where it stops, because we need to do our job right. We need to understand more of the reasoning there, for sure. Here's a couple other ones. This one's particularly true. So if anybody out there is supporting SQL Server 2008, it's now also true for SQL Server 2012, and Windows Server 2012 as well. Its extended support ends in October of this year. There is a carrot that Microsoft dangles in Azure, where for regulatory reasons, whatever, you're supporting older environments on this because it's the last certified version of whatever application's running. You can move those to Azure and increase your extended security update runway for another 3 years. So, I can think of a client I had once that was a hospital. The particular application was in the critical care part of the hospital. The vendor had last certified on an old version of SQL and then gone out of business. And the risk management people at the hospital said, no, we can't upgrade. No, we can't look around. This is compliant. It does what we need. Sure, everything's old, and the hardware was starting to fail. If you're in a situation like that, this is a very good motivation to move to the cloud. Now you're just going to move to a VM, most likely, so you do get those extended updates as well. So that's a situation where lifting and shifting is the right choice. It's often not. So, and you're going to hear me say this a few more times over the next half an hour or so. Moving to the cloud, especially for data folks, really for all of it, app, operations, everything, but for data folks especially, it's a way to reimagine the way our data estate looks. If we're sitting here saying, I run 50 SQL boxes on-prem now, my boss comes and says, hey, we need to go to the cloud this year, your head is going to first say, well, I'm going to run 50 SQL boxes in the cloud, but really dive into everything we're going to talk about over this next half an hour and understand that there are so many opportunities out there to consolidate, save money, to make your life easier, all those sorts of things that the cloud offers us. So be mindful of that as you think your way through this and start to plan. So we talked about how, why are we doing this? Who's going to start it? Maybe what the motivations might be. People are going to stand in our way here. And it's important to talk about that. The projects I've been on that have gone the worst are the projects that never acknowledged that this was possible. That somebody high up in the org said, cloud, all the things, and everybody figured like, well, everybody's just going to go along and do that. It's rarely the case, and you need to talk about this stuff up front, which is why I talk about it early on here too. So who can block this stuff and why? Because they have motivations too that may not always align with what the project goals are. So management support, first things first. I can think of a client that I had where essentially there were two competing vice presidents. One was over kind of application development and the database folks. One was over operations, networking, security, all those sorts of things. You could surmise from being in meetings that it was possible that they were competing for that next step up, which would have been like a CTO, CIO kind of thing. One's motivation was very much to reduce cost in their part of the organization. One's motivation was very much to modernize things in their part of the organization. You can certainly, modernize and reduce cost, but it does take a certain level of agreement and a bit of push and pull, which wasn't happening in this particular circumstance. So be mindful of that. Kind of look at those quarters of power, even though a lot of us aren't in an office a lot. Understand not only what the org chart says, who's in charge of who, but actually who kind of makes the wheels go, who makes things turn. Maybe it's not the spot on the org chart you think, but it's somebody that's won a lot of respect at a slightly lower level, and they actually kind of are the engine room for all this sort of thing. So it could be management, it could be operations. A common mistake that I see is operations people are not brought in early enough on these, that the data teams are often asked to lead these because the sales process begins with them. It's time for your SQL Server true up, and Microsoft comes to you and says, listen, it's going to be $2 million this year, but if you do Azure SQL with some of this, we can change that for you. So it falls on the data team's shoulder to begin the planning, which is why I begin this presentation the same way. This may be outside our purview, we think, but a lot of this is going to matter to us to make sure that the project gets off the ground right. But what happens is that they come to the data folks and say, okay, let's figure out how to make this work and how to make it talk to everything. And operations will just take care of their part whenever it comes up. Operations part starts right then too, because if you don't have a footprint in the cloud somewhere, they have to establish that. You've got to work with networking folks. Your security people are going to be very interested in how this is put together and all those sorts of things. And much like our teams, they have to resource plan too. So if you bring them in 3-6 months down the line, they're not going to be amused, and beyond that, they may not have time to help you. So it's important to kind of get everybody lined up front and understand, the push and pull on their time as well. If you're talking about supporting home built apps and things like that, the development teams may need to change stuff. Maybe you're moving to some sort of a PaaS database offering, and the way they connect is different, or it doesn't support a feature that they relied on heavily in their older code. That needs to be surfaced very close to the start of these. And similarly there, they need to make sure they have the resource to do it, to test it, and work with you and all the other teams to get this done. A couple other quick things I want to mention. Like I said, the security group, it's kind of their job to stand in our way, right? They want to make sure this is being done safely and in the best way possible, looking out for data breaches and all the fun stuff that can happen these days. They need to be brought in early, because generally in a lot of, especially the medium to large organizations I've been in, they have a massive amount of power to bring a project to a screeching halt, which is awkward and often bad for all of us. The networking team as well, that may be a part of your operations team, it may not be. be cognizant of their role here. Networking knowledge and a move to the cloud is massive. And unless your data team is sitting on a treasure trove of that, some are, most aren't, bringing your networking and operations folks in early to understand how this stuff is wired together and how it talks to each other, really important. Last but not least, DBAs might stall on changes. Maybe they've been told from some power that be that we're going from on-prem SQL Server with a box that you can log into to we're going to Azure SQL. And when you connect to that, it looks different and you're not comfortable with that. I've had clients through the years where that happened. The DBA said, well, we don't want to go to these because it looks weird. We can't do the stuff that we're used to doing. We're not comfortable with this. Be mindful of that and have a plan to kind of bring those folks along. None of this stuff is scary and none of it replaces our jobs. It changes the way we do our jobs. And that's probably a session of its very own. But like I said, I just want everybody to think about what can be in our way here. So we've kind of talked about moving mountains. So we're moving things out of the way, right? Like we want to set the good foundation, but people are going to drop mountains and hills and all that stuff in our way. So if you're coming in as an outside consultant, how do you execute one of these? Like I said earlier, organizational politics and understanding of that is really important. It's important as an internal employee as well, but you're going to need in general somebody to pull rank at a certain point to get something done. And it's really good if you know who that person is. They may be technical, they may not be. Understand everybody's interests at play and what the motivations are. Is everybody rowing the boat the same way in terms of saving money or modernizing, or is there some of this? And learn where those centers of power are. Build a rapport with them and make sure that those folks, that you're able to involve them when those times come. Kind of similar if you're an internal person, you likely know the politics better, but not necessarily. You may know the best way to work up the org chart and know how to get this stuff out of the way. But what I want to underscore here is if you're an internal employee and you're on the data team or you're the data team lead or something like that, and you've been asked to execute this stuff, this is a great opportunity to expand your knowledge and maybe your skill set outside of the realm of the job you've done. Like if you aspire into leadership or roles that are maybe data adjacent, this could be a great way to kind of show out a bit and say, listen, I've got skills beyond just the code I can write, the performance tuning I can do, all those sorts of things. All right, so where are we migrating these? That's kind of the key thing, right? We've talked for about 15 minutes on all the foundational stuff because that's what this talk is about. But once you've laid the foundation, you've got everybody lined up, it's funded, everybody's excited, they're working on this. We need to talk about where we're migrating these, right? No, we don't. We're not ready for that yet. Because I've been on projects like this where it's like, okay, it's funded, everybody's resourced, we are going. And let's just put it on Azure SQL XYZ or AWS RDS XYZ. We're not ready for that because we don't know how this stuff is going to run. So I talked about like the cost motivations, maybe timing motivations, strategic stuff, things like that. They influence the technical decisions heavily, but we need to understand that the tech target we choose, which we're going to talk about 3 slides after this, can actually support the workload and the performance that we need. And that's going to start with baselining. So how are we baselining our stuff? There's 3 main ways. I've been doing this a long time. Gut feel is certainly a thing. I have had jobs and I've certainly worked with clients where, for budget reasons or whatever, they didn't have tools available or they didn't necessarily have the tools they wanted or they didn't have enough licenses of it. So getting to know your environment and understand that, maybe my monitoring tool isn't yet showing that, server 01 is having a bad day, but I pay enough attention. I've been here long enough to know that it is or it's about to because of performance calls I'm getting or something like that. Gut feel baselining always happens and it's okay, but it shouldn't be the only thing we have. Referring back to what I just said, you may be in a circumstance where your boss is like, listen, this environment needs to perform awesome all the time. It can never go down, but we only have a very limited budget for you to buy the tools to support doing that. That's not right. And I'll say that I won't step on the soapbox for long because we only have a few minutes here. But if you're in an environment where you're under SLAs that are intense and you're under performance demands that are significant, and you're being told the budget for tooling doesn't exist, there should be a couple minutes for questions at the end of this. Let's have a chat about it there, or maybe offline, about how to make the arguments to support you and your team to get the tools that you need to be able to do your job. It is not fair for you to be asked to support an environment like that with tin cans and string. But I'll step off my soapbox now and say home-built tools are certainly a part of this. And even in environments where I've had tools that I liked, you end up sometimes building your own scripts, a few of them that's like, all right, well, this gives me a baseline of maybe this particular workflow that my app does, or something like that, that maybe the monitoring tool doesn't surface in a way that I quite like, but I know it's very important to a large customer of ours or something like that. So I've built a tool to do that. So home-built tooling is a part of this. Third-party tools, in my opinion, are the best part and the best way to ensure that your cloud migration is going to be successful. You want too much information on how your environment runs, to be honest. You're going to find out eventually. It's better to find out before you start, or as you're starting. In much the same way that, if you're flying a plane and you start to roll for takeoff and an alarm light goes and you're like, okay, we need to go get that fixed. You slow the plane down, you pull off the runway, it's fine. Once you've taken off, yeah, it's probably going to go okay after that point, but it's a lot more intense to try to fix it when you're off the ground than when you've just started that rollout. So third-party tools are going to help you. It's having that in a way that you can present it to executives is important. And a lot of those third-party tools give you nice dashboards and nice reporting and all those sorts of things. So you've got a chart that you can point somebody to that's not technical at all and say, this line needs to be higher. It needs to be up here, for us to migrate to the cloud and your destination of choice, maybe. So, all right, so we said we're not quite ready. We need to baseline our stuff and know how it runs. That's not it though. We're getting ready, we're close. How are we monitoring our stuff? That's incredibly key. And at the end of this, we're going to see some ways to do that. But it's critical that we're doing that. We are, whether you're asked explicitly for it or not, when we decide on a migration target that we're going to talk about right after this, we are explicitly or implicitly saying that everything's going to run okay on it. So we need to know that information. So the baselining is one part of it, right? The monitoring is something else. And not only do we need to make sure that our monitoring is good for the way our environment is now, we need to make sure it's good for the way it's going to be in the future as well. So that's a part of that decision as well. If your monitoring tool of choice that you really like maybe doesn't support a particular cloud option that you wanted to use, you may remove that from the list because you don't want to get outside of kind of your comfort zone of knowing what's going to happen. So I say we're not monitoring at all as an option. It really isn't. We really shouldn't begin one of these projects without some sort of monitoring in place. Again, home-built tools are likely a part of this. Baselining something different. You're kind of saying like on a nominal day, my speed is here, my CPU is here, memory's here, whatever. From a monitoring perspective, again, sometimes you're going to focus on key workloads, key metrics for a particular large client or something like that. You're probably always going to have something home built around. But I'll say again, the most successful projects of these and the projects that involve people under the least stress have third-party tools in play and have the budget for that. Because generally these projects get a lot of attention from folks that are A, executives and management, and B, no longer technical or never were. And these kind of tools make our job a heck of a lot easier when we've got to go back and say, well, this cloud thing we've chosen, we actually need to spin up some more of it. And here's why. Here's a chart that says it, our app is not going to perform as well. That tends to go much better than here's a script I put together that shows all these metrics that you may or may not know what they mean that say the same thing. Charts and graphs and GUIs are our friend with this, trust me. So are we ready to go? Not quite yet, but almost. We need to test this stuff. So, are we testing our workloads? Again, I say not at all here is an option because I've been a part of projects where that was the answer. It's not a good answer. We're going to be asked like, hey, when we move to the cloud, is performance going to get better? Is it going to be the same? We need to be able to answer that because again, a lot of this fair or not falls on the data folks because we're at the bottom, we're at the core, we're at the foundation of how all this stuff works. So if we're not testing it, we need to be pushing for that. That's likely not just an effort that we can lead, but we can lead the charge. If you're fortunate enough to be in an environment where you have internal automated load testing, that's an awesome option here. That, in my opinion, is the ideal. Not all of us are in an environment that's like that. A lot of it's kind of gut feel, right? Or, hey, we ran our deployment or we ran our burn-in tests after the deployment and they ran a little faster, so we think we made performance better. That's not load testing. If that's the kind of environment you're in, there are workload analyzer tools from vendors, from the cloud vendors themselves, from community stuff, from third parties, all of that do exist to analyze your workload on-prem and in the cloud as well. So make sure you're part of your migration plan is putting together a test site and make sure that you are testing it on both sides, because the answer to how will this perform can never be that tends to put projects and sometimes people in a very bad spot. So are we ready to migrate stuff and talk about where we're going? Now we are. So let's talk about it. So I said we would dive into IaaS and PaaS a little more here. So we'll do that briefly. So infrastructure as a service, again, if you're not familiar with that, it basically means VMs in the cloud, more or less. So we're managing everything from the operating system up. By managing, I mean maintaining, and I mean patching and backing up and all those sorts of things. So again, probably similar to the environment that a lot of us are in on-prem. So that's what we're used to. Platform as a service, not necessarily what we're used to. That would be the managed databases, the Azure SQL, AWS RDS, things like that, where, as you can see from the blue highlight, we're managing the data and apps there, but everything underneath it, we're not patching it. It will back itself up. There are generally options where we can kind of tune that and change how long it holds those for and all those sorts of things, but it's doing a lot of this for us. And so that, again, makes our lives easier and is often a place found to save some money as well. So that's not always, but it's something to be mindful of as you put together your plan. So where can all this go? So we're going to focus primarily on SQL Server here. There's a lot of options, and I'm going to go through them quick, and then happy to chat about these offline, maybe what might be right for where you are. So the easiest one is we spin up a VM, we put SQL Server on it. It's probably a cloud version of what we have now. We're comfortable supporting that. Connecting to this is going to be a little different, but we've brought our networking and operations folks along for this ride. They've got that handled for us. We know what we need to do. We can use Azure Migrate, which has come a long way, to lift and shift that. And again, the other big cloud vendors have equivalent tools here. Just we only have so much time. And a lot of SQL Server stuff is obviously running in Azure. Here we're lifting and shifting. Like I said, if you're currently managing 50 SQL VMs and your boss says, we're going to be in the cloud by the end of this year, your brain's immediately going to say, all right, I'm going to have 50 SQL VMs in the cloud. That may not be the right strategy for some of the reasons we've talked about and some that we're about to. Did we choose this for our comfort? It's likely to be a little more expensive than it currently is. Are we doing this for technical reasons? Maybe performance for us is absolutely critical. And on our cloud, on the managed database services, maybe we can't get exactly that bleeding edge performance that we need, and a VM is okay. That's okay. Somebody who gives a talk like this and says, VMs are always bad and you should never use them. It's not true. but it's the managed services are filling in a lot of the gaps they've had over the years. There's a lot of really good offerings there. So let's talk briefly about how Azure SQL is kind of put together. And I'll preface this by saying it has been at least 2 years, I think, since Azure SQL Database referring to this as like a single deployment model was Microsoft encouraged. I break that rule here because in my mind, it makes sense, especially for somebody that's brand new to this. And I have clients where they know they can run databases in the cloud, but that's where the knowledge stops. So Microsoft doesn't call it this anymore. I still like to call it that because at its core, it may just be a single database. It's fully managed. It's isolated, in this case, by the concept of a logical server. So we're going to connect to it where it's going to kind of look like an instance or a machine or whatever we're used to doing that now, but it's a logical server here. That's a single database. An elastic pool is essentially a collection of these, and much like 10 of you jump in the pool and there's pool toys and there's floaties and all that stuff, you all have to share that. You're not going to jump the fence by the pool to go get more stuff. You're kind of stuck with what you have, probably. For this circumstance, let's just say that's true. These databases are very much the same thing. They have a pool of resources that they can use to accomplish everything that they need to, and they're kind of grouped together in that way. Managed instance is a very different flavor of this stuff. So I want to kind of plant that seed. We'll get to that here in a few minutes. So what are the details here? And so I list some of this stuff just because there's things I've heard from clients that haven't been true for years, and I want to kind of underscore to this group that they're still not true now. So one of the knocks specifically on Azure SQL used to be that the T-SQL support just it's not the same as on-prem. That's really no longer the case. There are commands that aren't supported, but generally those are setting up high availability and things like that, which the managed service is doing for you under the covers. It doesn't give you the ability to run those because you can't. It has already done that. But a couple of things here. It doesn't support cross database queries. So if you have legacy code that does that, Azure SQL Database and its various service tiers are not maybe going to be the right thing for you, or going back to what we talked about towards the start, bringing your dev team in at this point and saying, hey, I would really like to go to Azure SQL Database general purpose, but there's going to require some changes from you. That may be the appropriate time to do this. Microsoft offers a tool called the Data Migration Assistant that basically smooths this path out. It will look at a database you have on-prem and say, hey, if you migrate this to managed instance, to Azure SQL, something else, here's the things that are going to break, here's the things that may work differently. It's a pretty nice tool, and in a longer version of this session, we would actually go into what that does. But if you're sitting here wondering, like, I manage a ton of databases, how do I figure this out? The Database Migration Assistant is your friend. There is no SQL Server agent. So in managed instance, there is, but in the other flavors of Azure SQL, there are not. So if you have a lot of agent jobs, there are other cloud-based automation ways to automate those things, but agent is not going to be on offer for you. Just a brief dive into the service tiers here, because we don't have time to go into every tier and kind of every nuance about what these are. So you see the three listed in the second point there. Their compute and storage is separated. So their performance is generally going to be pretty good for most of your workloads, but again, those ones that demand really high speed, these may not be the right landing zones for you. You do get an SLA of 4 nines, which is really solid. But if you need something a little bit more, you need something a little bit faster, these higher service tiers listed here on the bottom, their compute and storage is co-located, and so they've got a little less to travel. There's more speed on offer there if you need it. It of course also costs more as well, and you do even have the option with the BC tier where you've got a readable secondary replica as well if you need to direct reads or external client connections or something like that to it. But you are of course paying for that as well. Those do also come with a financially backed SLA too. If you want to know how much this stuff costs, given the time, we're not going to dive into this here. I'll have these slides uploaded on my GitHub, which is SQL at Speed, once we're through here. So you can click through these links and kind of dive into the nuances of how we cost these out, what the kind of older way is to do it, what the new way, all that stuff. But we shall move on. A couple things I want to call you. So we talked about kind of the OG service tiers. That's not really true because they didn't all exist at the start, but those are kind of the more common ones. If you're sitting there thinking like, well, gee, I'd love to land on Azure SQL something, but I've always heard that large databases aren't supported, and I haven't talked about any way for that to happen. Hyperscale would be the way to do that. If you're sitting on a database on-prem that's 20 terabytes, Hyperscale is the only place that you can put it really on the Azure SQL side of the fence. So I'm not going to get into the true nerdiness of kind of how all this works, but understand that it exists. And if you're thinking like, all right, well, we need to save money, large databases are expensive to run, right? You need a lot of storage. You need high-powered VMs, all those sorts of things. There is a managed service offering that's worth a look. Whether it's right for you, you kind of have to price out, test, make sure the performance is where you need it. But Hyperscale, the way it's architected, I think is pretty cool. And I think it's likely to give you what you need, but don't trust me, test it. Just a couple things here. So one of the things you may be thinking, and it's relevant to migrations because sometimes we use backup and restores to do that, right? And even some of the fancy tools we'll kind of wrap up here are basically still doing that. One thing unique about Hyperscale is it's essentially doing snapshot backups onto Azure Blob Storage. So it's not using up machine resources to do backups and restores and things like that. It's very minor. And this is one of those things you've probably seen like a marketing video or something. You're like, it doesn't work like that. It really does work like that. It is very cool. So I've been in environments where we had to back up databases that were very large, and of course you should be testing your restores and all those sorts of things. It's intensive, costs money. You got to have machines around that can do that, and this does kind of take that away. But it's not all cool stuff. So the Elastic Pool thing we talked about earlier, not currently supported. Of course, in the cloud, things change often. And for your accounting folks, it bills the compute and storage separately. Definitely something you'll want to go over with them because they're going to think they're getting double billed if they don't know how to read an Azure bill, and those Azure bills sometimes can be expensive, just like any cloud. Real brief, I think this is really cool. I could probably spend 20 minutes going into this. But this is how Hyperscale looks under the covers. You're going to see a lot of familiar names if you know how SQL Server is put together now. Some things are different. So it's just to show you it's not scary. They didn't reinvent the wheel, but they made the wheel work a little differently than it has and do a couple of different things. There's also serverless. So if you have a workload, if you're like, well, listen, I support a platform that, we have one busy day a week and it's intensely busy. Maybe it's fantasy football. So like Sunday is your big day, or who knows what it might be. And you're thinking most of the time, I don't need a bunch of performance, but that one day I do. Then serverless might be an option here. So you can kind of set thresholds, say, when I'm not busy, I need essentially this many vCores, like this many processors in a virtual sense to support my basic workload. But I need this maximum of whatever. And again, we know this through testing, right? To get me all the way there. That's there not only to make sure your workload performs the way you need, but to make sure it's cost controlled as well. One note, it is billed per the second. So that is another thing. I haven't mentioned. Accounting people will kind of wrap up with that, but the way some of these cloud services are billed in Azure is certainly not alone in that. It's something to be mindful of and know going in. With this kind of time, we don't have time to kind of cover everybody's service and how it's billed, but that's knowledge that we should have going into that stuff. Managed instance, I'll say all that. So it gives us all the PaaS stuff that's cool, patches, version updates, automated backups, high availability, all those sorts of things. If you're comfortable with on-premises enterprise edition of SQL Server And that's what your DBAs want, and that's where you want to land, but you want a managed offering of that. Managed instances where you need to be. Connecting to it's a little bit different than what we're used to. So you can go with a jump box. That's, for a lot of my clients, been the most comfortable through the years. You can also express route to it where you can reach that from your internal network. You can also set up a secure public endpoint as well. So if an app needs to plug into that and people are likely to rarely interact with it, that may be your best option there. But it's not quite as simple. Like, don't put a SQL box on the open internet. Managed instance really kind of takes that to its logical end, and these they are pretty locked down. So how are we moving this stuff? We just did a crash course on like all of our SQL Server options, right? All of our Azure SQL options, and then Amazon's same stuff there too. But how do we get it there? So there's a few kind of tried and true ways. Replication, it's no fun, right? It's old, it's not cool, it's not shiny. Everybody probably, or most folks, have a horror story about it, but you can replicate to cloud offerings here. You can set your managed database up as a replication subscriber and receive data that way. So if you're just trying to check a box, if your boss said, hey, we need a database in the cloud by June, and if you get that, you're getting a bonus, this may be the way to do it. Spin up a VM, spin up Azure SQL, some service tier, replicate, go to your boss and say, look, here's a cloud-based resource, our database is there. There you have it, right? You can do log shipping as well, and that is a wonderful option. I think that's actually kind of undersold. Replication, I would only recommend for certain sizes, certain experience levels, those sorts of things. Log shipping, as long as your networking and operations folks have kind of given you that footprint and that path to see this stuff, log shipping is a really straightforward way to do this. You can also do so in Management Studio, you can right click on a database and export. The choice is called export data to your application and save it to Azure. This is a really cool thing to demo. It doesn't scale particularly well. So if your database is quite small, or you just kind of want to show off, you can do it this way. Right click, click a few things and it goes. But for anything of any decent size, that's quite hard. If you're running always on availability groups, I was part of a project that did this. You can spin up a node in Azure, make it part of the cluster. Your networking and operations folks are going to have been heavily involved in this sort of thing. And you can, then you have cloud-based data. And if you wish to fail over to that or build subsequent nodes after that, you can then fail over to it. That is quite complicated. That would be probably a full day session on setting up the AGs, the networking, how to do it, how to schedule the failovers, all that sort of thing. But it's an option. Azure Migrate, we're going to talk about that here in a slide, but it's kind of the overarching tool set. Very cool. Specific to managed instance, there's the log replay service that gets its own slide here in just a second as well. The last two I want to mention before we move on, and these have kind of come out of the Microsoft world here in the last, I would say, few months. There's the Smart Bulk Copy tool, which is more of a command line based tool. There's a link to that on the resources slide here later. And if you're familiar with Azure Data Studio, there's a migration extension in there as well that really kind of smooths this out. And just like with ADS itself, they're iterating on it all the time. So if you used it a few months ago and you're like, it's always getting better and easier to use, which is a very good thing. Azure Migrate. So if you're sitting there saying, we've got web servers to migrate, we've got app servers, database servers, all that, Azure Migrate's going to be your friend. It is suited to this sort of thing. So there's a lot of individual tools under the covers of it that you probably used in those roles, but you can go in and say, I'm moving a web server, I'm moving an app server, I'm moving a SQL server, I'm moving other flavors of stuff, Postgres, who knows what. And it's going to get you to the tool you need to. And I put unified approach in quotes because that's what the marketing folks say, but that really is the goal. And it's been cool to see it come together over the last couple of years because it didn't necessarily start out like that. LRS. So log replay service is essentially log shipping to manage instance, but it's governed for us a bit. So a few notes, if you're like, hey, that sounds cool, just kind of a service to do that. Only supported on SQL Server 2008 or later. You need full diff and log backups rolling. Checksum needs to be enabled. I believe that has just changed or is about to. You need an Azure Blob Storage container to land those in. There are two different modes. So autocomplete is exactly what it sounds like. You say, database, you go here, and when it's done, it kind of severs the link to the ground, and your cloud-based. Continuous is basically manual mode. You set that link for it. So what did we learn? I'm going to make this quick. Haven't talked about licensing or accounting much at all, but understand how licensing is handled. Whether you're Azure-based, Amazon-based, whatever, understand what those agreements are, how those come together and all that, because this is way more complicated than going to the pricing calculator and trying to figure it out. That's where the rest of the organization gets involved. You're probably talking to the people that sign these checks. So make sure you do that. Make sure that DBAs and devs understand that the way they connect to this stuff may change. You don't want to migrate a database and have forgotten to tell people that it moved and how they can talk to it. Been there, done that. Please don't do that. Maintenance. We talked a lot about managed services, and a lot of this gets done for you. Not all of it, though. So it changes the tools you have to rebuild indexes and do backups and all those sorts of things, but it's still kind of your responsibility to make sure it's doing what you want. So be mindful of that as well. We talked about lift and shift not always being the right choice. The thing I want to wrap up with here is knowing why we're doing this is really important. That knowledge of politics is really important, and we have to know our environment really well. We have to have tested it. We have to be monitoring it. We should have baselined it, because we need to know in the cloud it's going to perform the same. Like I said, I wrote a book about this and other cool AI stuff. Those links are here. Resource links are here. Ways to find me are here. And Ray, I only went 2 minutes over, so I believe I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Matt.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Just really quick, does anyone have any really quick questions for Matt? I don't see anything in the chat. Okay, well, we'll have another opportunity at the end after Ray presents. So
I think there was a question in the question area.
I did. Do you see it? I don't see it. Sorry.
Yeah. It says, also with regards to billing, had a question: how do we plan the decommissioning of resources when we don't have enough clarity in the beginning? Is there any way of avoiding extra cost or any pre-built roadmap that can be used as, that can be used as a guideline?
Okay, I can cover that briefly. So your cloud provider of choice is, they're going to provide a fair amount of tools to kind of that roadmap, right? Cloud adoption framework type stuff. So that's one way. If you are engaged with a consulting partner, they're going to have their own roadmaps and accelerators to do that. If your team is already understaffed, they're going to have to support the new environment and the old one. Engaging with a partner can make sense there. There is unfortunately no fast track answer to this. The projects I've been where we didn't have clarity up front, we ended up having regular and kind of annoying meetings to go over this in great depth and basically keep annoying people to get the clarity that we needed. And there were a lot of various go and no-go dates in there, where if we don't know, what we're turning off by when and where it's going by, let's say, April 1, then it waits for the next wave. So we would schedule these in waves and kind of have a go, no-go date for each wave. So hopefully that helps. If not, feel free to email me, matt@sqlatspeed.com, and we can chat more about that.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys, Matt, can you tell me if you can see the screen, my screen?
I can.
Just to make sure. Okay,
you're
perfect.
good to go.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Matt. So we're going to talk about a little bit about SQL Diagnostic Manager, or monitoring tool for SQL Server. And to go back to what Matt's presentation, migration, I see it as a pre-migration and post-migration. And that's one of the things that we can do. So before you do that migration, if you have a monitoring tool, you will know your capacity, you will know your resources, you will know your baseline, you will know the history also of your systems before you can start doing a migration and do a hopefully a successful migration. In the same way, it doesn't matter, this is on premise, right? Whether you're working with virtual systems on VMware or Hyper-V, or if you have physical systems. Now, when you go into the cloud, then you have also ways of monitoring that. So you're monitoring your resources, you're monitoring things within the database and making sure that if you have any alerts, you can be proactive about all those things. So that's where I see it, fitting into those two buckets, pre and post migration. Now, SQL Diagnostic Manager is going to allow you to monitor all of your SQL servers, regardless whether they're physical, virtual, on-premise, or they're going to be also in the cloud in Amazon or Azure, right? 24/7, you're monitoring all of this agentlessly. So basically, you don't need any agent on those systems. You don't need any services, any objects. We collect the information in real time, and you decide what that real time is. If you want to do it every minute, every 5 minutes or so. The historical information, we keep it in a repository that by default is going to be 1 year of history. You can have more days or less days than that if you want to do that. Then we have tons of metrics. We have over 100 different metrics that include metrics from the database, includes metrics also from the OS. So if you're running on Windows, Hyper-V, or physical, CPU, memory, and disk. And then we also have metrics specific for the cloud. So we're going to see some of those later on, but we have also metrics specific for that cloud. And if you're running on a Hyper-V or VMware, we have metrics also for the virtual environment if you're doing that on premise. And then all of those metrics, they need a threshold. And we usually have thresholds for warnings and for critical. If something occurs, then you can be proactive about it, get an email, or even run a corrective action. And the actions can be anything to fix that problem or that condition. So very quickly here, I'm just going to cover the architecture, how it works, and I'm going to move on very quickly because we only have like 5 minutes. So cloud environment, physical, and a virtual environment, which includes more metrics about the virtual environment and more metrics about the cloud environment as well. All of this works from a centralized collection. We put that in a repository for 1 year by default, and then we see that from a console that we're going to take a look right now. So in this console, we're taking a look here at a virtual server. So you can see metrics and very quickly take a look at your dashboard, see what everything is doing in the last hour, or you can change the time frame. And the beauty about this is that you have a historical browser. So for example, if I want to see here what happened on the 19th of January, and I want to see the critical snapshot, in this case, I'm collecting data every minute, right? So I can go here at 2:30 p.m. and I can see everything that was going on there during that time. Or I can even zoom in into a specific time. On the top, you can see here, is very small for you, 1:19 at 12:50 p.m. That basically is the time that I'm looking at information here because there was high CPU or high memory or whatever it was, right? But I'm looking at the context of everything within that time. If I want to go maybe a couple of minutes before that, I can go back and into that time as well. Now, when I go here into sessions, I'm looking at that time, 1:28 on the 19th, right? And I can see all the sessions and the blocking sessions if I have. But what I want to look here specifically is the details, where I can take a look at the sessions, see everything that was running here, sorted by whatever I wanted. In this case, if it was CPU, right? Or if it was memory, or if it was physical IO, right? I can see my biggest offender. So when I go here on the bottom, I can see the host that came from the user, the application, the database, and what was executed, right? So I can see the full command here. So those are some of the things that will let you know exactly what problems you're having at that specific time. So this is historical. If I want to go into real time, I can go into real time and take a look at what's going on right now in real time. Okay. So going back into resources, understanding all of your resources, CPU, memory, understanding the memory of your system, understanding the memory that's allocated, and in SQL. And if we take a look at, for example, one of the cloud services that we have here, again, we can see that the allocated, what is being used, the CPU, right, for the server. We can take a look at memory, disk, right? And we have a lot of other metrics that we can have here for that environment. So if we look at the metrics and the alerts, we can see here for the cloud, if you're running on Amazon RDS, or in this case, we're talking about Azure, all of these different metrics that we have, right? And let me move this a little bit here so we can see all of those different metrics that we have. We can change the threshold on those metrics very easy. So if we think that low write percentage high should be, I don't know, 50 or 90 or whatever metrics thresholds do we want there, we can change that, right? Max sessions percent. These are specifically for Azure. But then we go into everything else that we have, whether we have availability groups, if it's on-premise, logs that are getting full, database status, database full, right? And we keep going into other things, resources, if we have those resources as well, blocking sessions, deadlocks that happen. So all of that information, we're collecting that here as well, okay? Not only we're doing that, but we also give you the ability to create alerts. So you can create any type of alerts that you want here. And very quickly, again, because we don't have the time, you can create any alert similar to what you do in Outlook. So you can say, if you have certain conditions, you can run certain actions. Okay, so in Outlook, for example, if my boss sends me an email after 5 p.m., those are two conditions, my boss and 5 p.m. And then the actions that I want is I want to forward that to my email, right? Personal email and mark it as important. Those two things that I want to do. Same thing here, where you can run actions like just sending an email, but you can run also a SQL script. You can run also an agent job, right? You can run also a PowerShell script if you're running something on a physical or virtual machine, right? You can run a batch file. So you can fix the problem automatically. So for example, if I have a log that is getting full, one of the things that I can do is I can do a backup to basically remove all the inactive transactions of that. So automatically you can do that whenever your log is, let's say, at 90% full, okay? Understanding your capacity is something very important. I'm gonna go here to my physical server. And then you can see all of your databases. You can see the data file size, your data index, okay, data text. So very quickly, you can see what are your top 5 databases and compare that and compare the log size as well. So this is very good to understand your capacity before you do any type of migration. Understanding your indexes and your tables. So I can take a look here at a database. Let me see one that has some good information. So you can see here all of your tables and your indexes is loading. And then you can see on the bottom the size of your data, size of your indexes, your dependencies that you have, and so on. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about, if you want to fine tune your systems, we have an analyze part. And we have a lot of other things we can talk about an hour and a half on this product. But very quickly here, analyze, where you can run an analysis on many, many things, many different areas that we provide. About 128 different analyses that we have. And basically we give you recommendations. So whatever we found, whether it's something with indexes, whether it's something with backups, whether it's something with security, right? Policy securities, whether it might be something with the query store, okay? It might be something with partitioning or something like that. We're gonna give you a lot of different recommendations. In many cases, we're gonna give you why we give you that recommendation, maybe an external link so you can learn more about that. And in some cases, we even give you the optimized script to optimize that within that tool. That's great, okay? So that's basically what I had. I mean, I know this is a very comprehensive product, but just wanted to give you a 10-minute presentation on that. And now I leave it for some other questions that we might have.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, does anyone have any other questions before we wrap up? I don't see anything in. So just a reminder to everybody that all of our SQL tools have a free trial that you can download through our website. We also have a more in-depth SQL Diagnostic Manager demo every Thursday. So please go onto our website and sign up for Getting Started demo if you'd like to get more details. Other than that, thanks Matt, thanks Ray for joining us or presenting today, and thanks to everybody for attending. And with that, we'll wrap it up, and everyone have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.